This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 63. We're going to start today's episode with a question from Jackson from Ohio, who says, "What's the deal with COVID-19 and loss of smell? I lost my sense of smell entirely for 3 months the first time I got COVID in 2021, and my sense of smell is still altered to this day."
The COVID era, March 2020, the month that the world learned the word anosmia, the inability to smell. And in about two-thirds of people who get COVID, there is anosmia, transient loss of a sense of smell. In most cases, it's complete loss. In some people, it's partial. On a subset of people, it just winds up being a distorted sense of smell, which is a whole separate world of oddities going on there. And it has a number of characteristics. The first is rapid onset within a few days. The other characteristic is unlike the questioner, it usually disappears after a week or two rather than months later. Okay, so what is the cause of this? Why do people lose their sense of smell with COVID infection? So we look into the nose, and way up on top, there's this tissue, the nasal epithelium, and in there are the cells that detect odors, neurons that have odorant receptors. And in this very literal sort of way, like you open up a container of cinnamon, as mommy was doing today in the kitchen with some baking, and you smell it, it means a tiny, tiny microscopic molecule of cinnamon has gotten up your nose and is bound to a receptor on a olfactory receptor neuron. So extend that same logic to bodily fluids and things like that, and you can see why olfaction is disquieting all sorts of ways. So you've got the main neurons in there, the olfactory receptor neurons that are responding to smell molecules with receptors on cilia, little hair thingies on the top of the neurons, and that's where the odorant binds to. So that's what's going on there, except as with a lot of the realm of neurons, there's a second cell type there that is meant to just sustain the neuron, a support cell. And the main type is called a sustentacular cell. And if you want to try to remember that, it's a cell that sustains in a spectacular way, sustains those neurons, so sustentacular cells. And what they are is they're kind of wrapped around the neurons, and they provide comfort. When the neuron laughs, the sustentacular cell laughs. Also, when the neuron is sad, it holds it tight. It supports it in all sorts of ways. It secretes mucus. Mucus, at long last, we are talking about mucus in here, little bits of mucus which glom around the cilia. What good is that? The mucus, being mucus-like, is sticky, and the odorants get caught in there and then are presented to the cilia. The mucus traps the odorants in there. So these support cells are useful for making the mucus. They also loan energy, glucose, to the primary neurons themselves. They secrete a factor that makes sure the cilia are happy and healthy. So they're supportive cells sitting there. So along comes anosmia once people get COVID. And the question became what's going on? And immediately people generated all sorts of theories. Oh, obviously, you got so much mucus in there that is just like blocking the whole system. And that turns out not to be the case. You don't get massive amounts of mucus. The mucus we're talking about here is little micro amounts. So the problem is not an excess of mucus, but as we'll see, bitter irony, the explanation is something very different from that. So with that explanation went down the tubes. People said maybe it's damaging the olfactory nerve that goes from these olfactory receptor neurons up into the brain. No evidence that that's happening. Ooh, maybe the virus is killing those neurons. No evidence for that either. Maybe there's an autoimmune attack on the olfactory system triggered by the virus. The time course doesn't work. You don't get an autoimmune attack triggered going into action 3, 4 days after the virus gets in there. So all sorts of theories have been discarded. What's the thing that seems to actually be going on? The virus does not get into the neuron. The neuron doesn't have a receptor for it. COVID, the virus, piggybacks onto a receptor called the ACE2 receptor, which is the means by which to slip into cells. These neurons don't have many ACE2 receptors. They don't get in there. And this is a common theme. There's not a lot of viruses that get into neurons. How come? Because the main thing a virus does when it gets into its cell is it wants to make copies of itself. It hijacks the cell's cell replication machinery to make more copies of itself. Neurons don't divide. Jargon, they are post-mitotic. They don't have all the bells and whistles around to do cell division. So very few viruses get into neurons. Small subset neurotropic viruses like herpes virus, they're really fancy and interesting. COVID is not one of those. COVID does not get into the neurons. It gets into the support cells. It gets in there very readily. Okay, so the COVID virus gets into these support cells, and what they seem to do is wreak havoc there. They cause the support cells to become dysfunctional. They kill the support cells outright. And what happens as a result? Here's the bitter irony. Your problem winds up being too little mucus being made there because the support cells are out of whack. They don't make enough mucus, so it's not trapping odorants. In addition, these olfactory neurons in there are miserable because they're not being given glucose by the support cells, which is one of the main things that happens. In addition, as I said, the support cells release this trophic factor, a factor that perks up the cilia, and the cilia are sort of atrophying away, and inflammation seems to make it worse. So that seems to be the most likely scenario. And what is then seen is it takes weeks or sometimes months for new cilia to grow, for the support cells to recover from the trauma of the virus, and the sense of smell comes back. Okay, so this is really interesting. It's also really interesting in that there's some interesting parallels out there because what the COVID virus turns out to be horrifyingly good at is getting into the brain. And one of the main ways it does it is by way your olfactory system. If you want to get to the brain, that's one of the fastest ways in. These olfactory receptor neurons are just a couple of synapses away from getting into Grand Central Station in your brain. A lot of viruses piggyback through this olfactory system to get into the brain, and the COVID virus does that as well. The COVID virus gets in through the epithelium, the nasal epithelium gets into the neurons, and rather than getting into the neurons, it gets into the brain by way of the olfactory system there, gets in there, and you see stuff like the more severe somebody's anosmia is, the more severe, the more total, the more long lasting, that correlates with the more changes in the brain, the more neuropsychological problems, memory issues, the more thinning of the cortex that gets the olfactory projections, the more loss of white matter going on in there. So that is a pretty strong vote that this is not just a way of knocking out your olfaction, it's a way of the virus accessing the brain. And implicit in that is something that should disturb folks, which is our problems with COVID are not over with. It is still out there. It is still mutating. It is still dangerous for the people, the now millions of people who wound up with termed long COVID, formerly known as post-acute sequelae of COVID infection. It involves a lot of neurological damage, and people are still trying to figure that one out. And it persists for years, and nobody knows why there's a transition from a COVID infection to a case of long COVID. Nobody knows how to cure a case of long COVID. So that under the best of circumstances would be a little bit problematic, but just to hark back to one of last week's topics, most of the funding for long COVID research for interventions to stop the transition from COVID to long COVID, most of the work on that is being savaged by our new administration. So that's not getting fixed anytime soon. Any case, that's what the anosmia is about. If I had to describe the wishes that the COVID virus had, it would not be to make people anosmic. It would be to use that as a really quick way into the brain.
All right. Next, Bryce from New York says, can you explain the results from the 1983 Libet et al. Study?
Libet et al., 1983. If you think about free will or absence thereof, and you think about biology and you write a paper on the subject, it is almost required by law that by the second paragraph of the paper, you make reference to the Libet et al. 1983 study. Libet was Benjamin Libet, a neuroscientist at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, published a paper there that, depending on whether you believe the interpretation or not, proved there's no free will. And people have been fighting about it ever since. And in reviewing it here, I think the safest thing to say is I view the entire Libet thing as a distractor, as a shaggy dog story. All right, so what went on in it? You get a volunteer, you sit them down, and you put electrodes all over their heads. Remember, it's the 1980s, so that was state of the art to get EEGs, electroencephalograms, seeing what electrical activity was in different areas at different time points. You wired up a little probe thing on the person's finger to tell when their finger muscle was tensing. You sat them down. And there is a button here, and you would say to the person, okay, relax, kick on back, loosen your tie, and whenever you feel like it, press the button. Don't plan ahead. Just as soon as it occurs to you to press the button, press the button. And here's the final step. Right in front of you is a gigantic clock with like a 2-second sweep on it. And do us a favor, look at the clock when you decide to press the button and look at exactly what time it is so you could tell us afterward. This was the Libet experiment. So the person is able to say, here's the exact point where I decided I was going to push the button. And because of those probes on the finger, they can tell when indeed the finger started pushing the button. And it turned out it would be about a 200 millisecond lag time, 0.2 of a second between when the person formed the intent to push the button and when the finger started moving. All right, that's fine. What about the EEG stuff, saying what was going on in the brain? And it turned out people at the time were learning about a particular waveform pattern of the EEGs, which they call the readiness potential. And a readiness potential was an indication that the brain was geared up to do something. It was prepared. It was ready. It was ready to do something. And by all logic, what you would see is the person would say, okay, I just formed that intent. And then you would see the readiness potential came 100 milliseconds after that. And 200 milliseconds, the finger would begin. That would be if the world made sense. And what Libet reported that floored everyone is no, the readiness potential came before the person was conscious of forming the intent. Approximately 300 milliseconds, 0.3 of a second. Your brain was communicating that it had committed to pushing the button 0.3 of a second before people would say, I just decided to do that. Whoa, this was totally amazing. Immediate issues. So, are you looking? The brain has already decided to push the button before you have formed the intent, or has the brain decided to do something? Are we just seeing a generic readiness? So, sort of the next generation of experiments was carried out by this guy, Patrick Haggerty, University College London. And instead of either you do nothing or you press the button, You do one of two things. Either you press this button or that button. So we're no longer looking at the difference between not doing anything and doing something. We're looking at the difference between doing this or that, a cleaner design. So he did that and got the same punchline. The readiness potential indicating we're going to push this button versus pushing that one. Push whichever one you want whenever you feel like it. The readiness potential was coming about 300 milliseconds beforehand. Then we got to Libet like 3.0. And this was a scientist, John Dylan Haynes, who working in Humboldt University in Germany. And what he did was take next generation stuff. Instead of just electrodes, EEG, along came brain imaging, functional brain imaging, so you could get a much more precise localization of what was going on. And he replicated Libet and blew people open because he was able to go a couple of steps higher from where the readiness potential was occurring. A part of the brain called the supplementary motor cortex, the neurons that are just ready to say, okay, motor neurons tell the fingers to do this. He was able to trace it a few steps higher up into the prefrontal cortex, sending commands down the line to the supplementary motor cortex. He was able to see the prefrontal cortex was making a decision up to 10 seconds before the person was claiming, I just decided to do this. Whoa, one step further, Libet 4.0, then a neurosurgeon at UCLA named Yitzhak Fried was doing single unit recordings in the brains of people. People where you were doing brain surgery and you were going to take out part of the brain and you had to see what were these neurons doing, and sticking electrodes into single neurons in these relevant areas and giving them a Libet type study and showing the same thing at the level of single neurons that were deciding it's time to push the button, were deciding before the person was consciously aware of this. Okay, so the folk interpretation that everybody immediately had was, oh my God, your brain decides before you do. You've got no free will because your brain already decided. Okay, obviously this is dualist nonsense because you are not separate from your brain. It reminds me of like the quip of I've always thought of my brain as my most important organ, but then I thought, who's telling me that it's the most important organ? Folk determine it. We've just proven this. Your brain decides before you're consciously aware of it. The more sensible interpretation that came out from Libet type supporters was that commitment to an action is occurring before there is conscious awareness of that commitment, that intent. The conscious awareness is literally an afterthought. Okay, so big surprise, big surprise. People have been fighting over this ever since, and all sorts of folks did not like this interpretation at all. Let me tell you basic about science. You publish a paper, and it's going to be cited by subsequent papers, subsequent scientists whose work has been influenced by the work in that paper, an average of maybe 4 times, 5 times. By the time it's 2, 3 years after you publish a study, everyone has already forgotten about it. It's got a shelf life of like no time at all. That's what your normal paper is. The Libet paper, it's been more than 40 years and people are still fighting over it. People, as of a couple of years ago, are still publishing papers with titles like Benjamin Libet had his head up his, and they're still doing that 40 years after. Like, for people to be trashing your scientific study 40 years after you published it, that is immortality, to have published something important enough that 40 years later, some people still believe it and other people are saying it's not. People are still fighting over it. What is the fight about? First off, how accurate is the timing thing of this clock? And you're looking at it. And one of the early snotty critics of Libet accused him of chronotheology, of having misplaced faith in his measurement techniques. So that was kind of snarky. But the strongest criticisms have revolved around a few things. First off, you decide whenever you feel like it, when you form the intent, push a button. Pushing a button tells us something about free will. Pushing a button is like a model system for how we get our moral compass, how we make the most important decisions in our life. This is so atomistic and little twiddly thing that this is telling us about nothing. Tell us about something a little bit more consequential than whether or not you push a button. Subsequent experiments put people in a driving simulator. Do they have to suddenly jerk to the left or jerk to the right? And what's that have to do with readiness potentials? Same sort of thing. So something more complicated than pushing a button, driving competently. Then one of my all-time favorite studies, I don't know how they were convinced to do this, but people got a bunch of bungee jumpers and got them to jump off a cliff on a bungee cord, and they had an EEG apparatus like glued to their head, transmitting up to the scientists on top. The scientists were not jumping with them, but they had this whole thing up there. They looked like Martians who were convinced to bungee jump after getting drunk with some frat bros or something and jumping off. And, you know, when to decide I'm going to jump is a little bit more consequential than when I push the button. And back comes the same finding, which is, yeah, you're getting something resembling a commitment to the action before the conscious awareness. Okay, that's action. How about thought? Thought, we're making a lot of decisions just in our head. Maybe we're just getting gummed up in like muscles and sluggishness of deciding to do something is a little bit faster than deciding to tell my muscles to do that something. Studies were now, instead of having to take an action, someone would look at a number, and whenever you feel like it, decide whether to add two to that number or subtract two from it. Pure thought, tell me when you decided it, and a different part of the brain, not running your muscles, but a different part of the brain would show the same property of activating a readiness potential before there was conscious awareness. So that was the first criticism. A finger, this is the basis of all of philosophy going down the tubes. At least some more complex scenarios seems to work the same way. The next criticism, so you've got, you know, an MRI that the person's inside when you throw them off the cliff and they're bungee. And thanks to this, you can tell what decision they're going to make before they're even aware of forming the intent. That would be if this readiness potential thing predicted 100% of the time what someone would be doing, as opposed to chance level 50%. And what the studies were showing was predictability in the 60, 70% range, like a little bit better than chance. Reliably better, enough you could do statistics on it. But the critics went crazy over this one. Wait a second, you are going to rip apart millennia of Western thought about us having free will and agents of our actions based on 60% instead of 50% predictability. That is totally pathetic. So squabbles over that, but then people really got into the high grass of the philosophers and the neuroscientists getting trapped in elevators together, arguing about also, is there a difference between picking and choosing? I spaced out on the first page of this paper trying to explore that. Is there a difference between a decision and an urge? Is there a difference between having intent and being aware that you have the intent? Is there a difference between intent and intention? Is there a difference between wanting and intending? What does it mean if someone tells you to be spontaneous? Whenever you feel like it, press this button. What do you do when it has been determined that you are going to be indeterministic? People have been fighting over this. Where does consciousness come into this? Is consciousness necessary? People then introduced a great additional concept in addition to free will, free won't. Maybe the brain decides to do something before you're consciously aware of it. Libet was right, but you consciously have the willpower, the agency to veto it. You may not have free will, but you have free won't. And these were studies where, you know, push the button whenever you feel like it, but a computer randomly saying some of the time, no, don't do it. And could you stop? Could you show that you were intending to stop? after you were already seeing the brain indications of stopping it, turned out to be the same muddle of stuff. Okay, so I think it's perfectly fair to say, insofar as people are still fighting over the difference between picking and choosing and at each other's throats in conferences, 40 years later, it is still not clear what the Libet experiment was showing us, other than it's totally fascinating. And there's so much more to be done about it. And this is where I've made all sorts of people not friendly to me by writing the opinion that I think Libet has nothing to do with the free will debate. It doesn't matter when the readiness potential occurs and when you first form conscious awareness. It doesn't matter if the readiness potential was about deciding or an urge to decide. It doesn't, none of this stuff matters because it's looking in the wrong place entirely. If you want to see whether or not free will is going on, you don't want to know when the muscles start contracting and when the readiness potential, and whether that tells you anything about when people decide to or not to sacrifice themselves for somebody else and heroic, and when massive moral decisions are made. It's got nothing to do with it because it's not asking the only relevant question that you can ask. Yeah, you form this intent. Maybe it came after the potential, maybe it came before, maybe we can't measure it accurately, maybe whatever, but you formed the intent. Where did that intent come from? How did you wind up being the sort of person who would form that intent at that millisecond? And let's back up and see, this is actually an enormous question. How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would learn how to read and wouldn't die of a childhood infectious disease? How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would go to college, who would have an interest in psychology, who would take a Psych 101 class? How do you turn out to be the sort of person who would have the combination of, oh, I don't know, altruism and curiosity to sign up for one of these experiments? How did you turn out to be the sort of person with enough frontal cortical function at age 18 to write down where the experiment was and what time you had signed up for, and to have it together enough to show up? How did you wind up being the sort of person who, sitting down in the chair to do this experiment, didn't have all sorts of oppositional, I don't know, father issues with the grad student and decide, oh, I know they're trying to trick me and I'm going to show I'm smarter than them. I'm going to screw up their experiment intentionally. How do you not turn out to be that sort? How do you turn out not to be the sort of person who would come in there and they're all busy with the other volunteers sitting there just finishing up with them because nobody's looking? You just steal the grad student's laptop and run out. How did you become the sort of person who would wind up in that spot in that moment in your life and form that intent? And when you look at that, all that is the end product of all the biology over which you had no control and its interactions with the environment over which you had no control. So the Libet experiment is totally great. There's got to be like some opera written about it soon or a dessert topping, and it's totally interesting. But unlike what a lot of people in the field think, and I have irritated a lot of people with this, I think it tells us nothing about whether or not we have free will, not what was going on in that moment. How is it that you turned out to be who you are in that moment?
Okay, finally, Spencer from Alabama says, considering that human brains are still the same, how has the disparity between the wealthy and the poor changed since the incident of Yerge Doja?
I love getting to do this. Not only today did I have reason to go recall how it is I memorized sustentacular cells in the first place for some final exam, but this was my chance to find out about Yerge Doja. Yerge Doja, not on everyone's lips, but apparently in Alabama. So, Spencer, congratulations on that. Yerge Doja was a Hungarian Transylvanian in the early 16th century. He was a soldier and a very accomplished one, apparently a very good fencer. And he first gained fame during some war between the Hungarians and the Ottoman Turks, where I don't know how this happened, but one of the Ottomans was the greatest fencer in all the Ottoman army. And Yurgay said that he was on his side, and they stopped the war in order to have like the two armies for a circle around, and the two of them had a dueling match. And Yurgay managed to cut the guy's hand off, which hobbled him up a bit, and then he killed him. So Yurgay was wildly celebrated for this, and he was made some sort of minor noble, and the nobles gave him a lot of money. And 2 centuries afterward, his family coat of arms still had a decapitated, I guess you can't decapitate an arm, still had in the coat of arms an arm cut off. And given that he only cut the hand off, that seems a little bit grandiose. Okay, so he's famous for that. So he's settling into his fame, and there's trouble brewing in River City, which is the Pope, Pope Leo, a different Pope Leo. Pope Leo decided it was a time for another crusade to try to push the Mohammedans, the Ottoman Turks, out of Europe, and he wanted the people in Hungary to do it. And he decided, just for a fun twist on things, instead of it being the nobles, where what they did was they went off to be knights and fight and all of that, this would be a peasant crusade. And he instructed the nobles to go force the peasants to do this. And he instructed the bishops and the cardinals to instruct the lunch bucket priests off in the parishes to go round up the peasants, to have this peasant crusade. And they rounded them all up, and they said, we need a leader, and let's get Yurgay cutting off the guy's hand. He's going to be the leader of it. And he got all into it. So they assembled something like 70, 80,000 peasants or so that were all ready to do this, which is where a problem occurred, which is Pope Leo and the cardinals and the bishops and the nobles didn't bother sending food to this army, which got a little bit disgruntled. The hoi polloi priests were already pretty resentful of the church hierarchy. All the peasants were pretty resentful of the hierarchy that filled up the rest of their lives there with the nobles. And Yurgay sort of roused this rabble by saying, forget getting the Ottomans out of here. Let's get the ruling class. And everyone said, yep. And there was an uprising, a peasant uprising, and they burned castles and they burned cathedrals and they killed tax collectors in all sorts of gory ways typical of that time period. And they actually apparently got fairly close to the capital, and everyone was wetting their pants, hiding in their castles there, waiting to be saved. And eventually the nobles and their armies got it together and crushed him and captured Yurgay Doja. And of course, they then tortured him in a very conventional way. But one extra little tidbit there that made all this reading worth it, they put him on some chair, an iron chair that had been heated to like glowing hot, and put a glowing hot crown on his head for wanting to be the leader of the people. So that's searing him and doing him in. And then they wrestled in like 4 or 5 of his closest followers, his senior staff, and they made them eat him alive. I kid you not. They got pincers that had been in hot coals, steaming hot pincers, and they would pinch off a piece of his flesh and say, here, eat it and swallow it. It's like if you watch Survivor, they have those points where a couple of contestants are having to race to eat something totally disgusting, some giant squirmy grub or something, and who gets to finish it first. And what they have to do is once they swallow it, they go, they have to show Jeff Probst that they swallowed an open mouth. They did the same thing to them. You can't hide it into your cheek. Open your mouth, stick your tongue out to show that you actually swallow it. And the followers who swallowed pieces of Yurgay Doja were forgiven, and the other ones were chopped off, and they killed 70, 80,000 peasants as revenge for it. So this was Yurgay Doja. And there appears to be a lot of ambivalence about him in Hungarian history. He's been a hero with every peasant uprising since then. Big surprise, during the communist era, he was a major national hero fighting the ruling class. The powers that be now are a little bit uncomfortable about putting up statues of him. So he's mostly celebrated now for having been an amazing fencer and that cut off arm sort of thing. Okay, So that's Jurge Doja. And thank you again, Spencer, for giving me an excuse to find out about the pincers. So that was a pretty crummy time to be a peasant or to be a low ranking priest or to be, that was tremendous inequality. We still have basically the same brains. And thus the question, what's happened to inequality in the centuries since then? Have things gotten any better? So, of course, it depends on how you're defining inequality. You could first define it on the level of power. How much power do individuals have in their society? Do some people have a whole lot more power than other people? Do some people have the power to turn others into slaves? The power to make children work to death in factories? Have the power to burn widows at the stake? Have the power to rape brides on their wedding nights because you're the nobleman and they are in your feudal domain or some such thing, power to do those sorts of things. What has happened to the inequality of power, the control people have over their lives to elect their leaders, to decide what's been going on with that? And the news there overall is pretty good. There's this wonderful book by Harvard Steven Pinker, book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And if you mention it, you are required to call it magisterial because it is magisterial. And what he reviews is how all things considered when it comes to, hey, you can't make slaves anymore and it's not okay to do this to people. And it's kind of nice if people choose their leaders. Things have been getting better over recent centuries, and now a greater percentage of Earth chooses their leaders than at any time in history. Every country on earth pays at least lip service to saying that slavery is not a good thing. There's still tons of it in India, for example, debt slavery in the Western Sahel, like Mauritania and Mali. There's still a lot of slavery that's pretty openly recognized, but at least every government on earth is saying it's not a great idea to do that. There's laws against child labor. There's all things have gotten better in that regard. And Pinker has argued, and some people have sort of disagreed with him on this, what has been the driving force for the world becoming a nicer place? Let's reframe it as the world becoming more equal in terms of people having control over what happens to them in their lives. What's been the driving force on that? And his theory is the Enlightenment that really made people much more open to ideas of empathy, and there's more similarities and differences and morality and whatever else the Enlightenment folks were doing. Okay, so from the standpoint of inequality, of some people have very little control over their lives and other people have a whole lot more over other people's, that's been getting better. But inequality in the sense that's mostly meant here, which is economic inequality. How unequal is a society? And economists, turns out there's two measures they typically use. Something is called the Gini index, which is kind of charming. How much money would you have to take away from the wealthy to distribute among everyone else to give everybody the same income? How much of the total economy would have to be shifted? What is the Gini index? The higher the number, the more money you would need to move around to make things more equal. The other thing that economists tend to do is something called the T10 B50 measure. What's the ratio of the income of the top 10% to the bottom 50%? So, using those two measures, all sorts of economists have been looking at this, and in general, the records are pretty lousy before 1800 or so. Most of it is like 1820 to the present. So, what's happened to economic inequality? Depends on how you're measuring it. In addition to whether you're using the Gini or the T10B50, although they tend to give very similar results, depends on if you were measuring inequality within a country or inequality between countries. And if you're measuring it between, in 1820, there was not a whole lot of inequality because pretty much every country was full of people who were being subsistence farmers or shepherds or some such thing. And then along came the Industrial Revolution in the West, and inequality, as in how wealthy are the 10% wealthiest countries compared to the poorest 50%, that ratio has just been skyrocketing ever since then. Interestingly, since the 1980s, it's been going down a bit, and that apparently is mostly due to the tiger economies in South and Southeast Asia lifting ridiculous numbers of people out of poverty with their sort of economic growth. But okay, that's between countries. Not terribly interesting, because what we really want to know about is not why is it that Switzerland is more wealthy than East Swatini and what the ratio is. We want to know within a society how much inequality there is, and using Gini index or that ratio within a society. So what has been seen, and what pretty much all the studies show, if you're just looking at industrialized countries, if you're looking at Western Europe, if you're looking at, to a large extent, the degree of inequality now is about the same as it was in 1900. Very roughly the same. How much you would need to redistribute wealth is roughly the same. How much more do the very wealthy have than the lower 50%? Roughly the same. What the pattern has been over this last century, though, was a drop in inequality during the Depression, after World War II, and things coming back since then. The United States has shown the same sort of pattern, which is a drop currently, levels of inequality about what they were in 1900, a drop, Depression, World War II, and skyrocketing upwards since the early 1980s, which I think most people in the know say that had something to do with Reagan economics that got put in place then. So that's been the pattern of its remain, fluctuations, have a good depression, have a good world war, people get distracted, but it's been roughly in that area. And in the US, at least, it is on a dramatic upswing, as has been the case in most Western European countries. Turns out there's one additional measure of this that I think is much more informative than a Gini index or that T10B50 thing. And this comes from this French economist, Thomas Piketty, who came up with this ratio of looking at, he's got an equation, R over G. G is the degree of economic growth in a society. G is how much actual stuff is a society making, how many new aglets. Many episodes ago, we talked about telomeres, which are at the ends of chromosomes, and people always use the same metaphor, which is they're like the little plastic wrappings at the end of shoelaces. And I didn't know what they were called at the time. They are called aglets. How many aglets are being made per year? How many tractors? How many tons of cornflakes? What is the productivity of a society? That's the G. On top is the measurement R, return on investment. What's that about? I'm no economist, and the best I can do to sort of understand in my mind what R is all sorts of stupid shit that's going on in society that's just making money for rich people that accomplishes nothing. Profits, dividends, rents, interest payments, all of that, that is not growing a society. That is wealth getting concentrated even more so among the wealthy. So what Piketty has come up with is this index of what's the ratio of how much of the economy is running on this nonsense of capital and how much of it is running on actual growth. The worse the ratio, the more of the economy that's being devoted to nonsense, making money for its own sake. This is a world where, how stocks work. This aglet factory is making the same number of aglets today as it had yesterday. And because somebody hiccuped on Wall Street, nonetheless, the company is 30% wealthier today than it was yet. Complete disconnection from actually doing useful stuff. And what his point is, the more extreme the ratio, the more the economy is dominated by the nonsense versus the real growth, the more it's a feed forward mechanism to concentrate more and more of the wealth in the upper stratum and generate an oligarchy and generate instability. And this is not a good thing. Okay, so what do we have here in response to this question? If you're defining inequality as some people have less control over critical decisions in their lives than other people do, that's been getting better. But if you're coming to inequality from the traditional economic standpoint, it hasn't gotten much better in a long time. And current trends, like over the last 30, 40 years, are that it's getting worse. And we have, by the estimates of most people who study this, somewhat of a feed forward cascade now for generating more and more oligarchic wealth concentrated in the upper stratum, officially not a good thing. So I think what we can conclude is that if Yergey Dojo was around now and had some of his flesh back and working, he would be encouraging yet another peasant uprising.
But since he isn't around, we'll encourage for him. And that is it for episode 63. Keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.